Aristotle makes a distinction early on in the Nicomachean ethics that sounds simple at first, but turns out to actually govern almost everything about how effort, how discipline or excellence actually works in our own lives. Aristotle separates all purposeful activities into two kinds. The first kind he calls praxis, which is activity where the purpose is contained in the activity itself. The second kind he calls poiesis, which is activity where the purpose is to produce something that is external, something that can be finished and assessed on its own terms. And the reason this distinction matters for us is because each kind of activity has its own internal logic. Each kind of activity has its own internal standard of excellence and its own relationship to the question of when enough is actually enough, or when something is actually considered finished. But once these two kinds of activities are confused and mixed together, then our efforts will begin to distort them. We'll start treating forms of living as if they were products that have to be finished. But our lives, our character, or our state of health, these are not the kind of things that can be completed once and for all. So effort no longer comes to rest in the end. It just keeps demanding more while giving less back. And discipline itself will start to feel less like an ordering force and more like a source of pressure. Now, praxis is the domain of living. Things like acting well, exercising good judgment, taking care of the body, forming good habits, or conducting yourself stably and reliably in changing circumstances of your life. None of these can ever produce a finished object. You can't complete your health, you can't finalize your character, you can't arrive at a definite version of good judgment and then simply move on to something else entirely. Instead, excellence in this domain, in praxis, always shows itself in continuity. It shows itself as the ability to move through situations with appropriate responses and without constant internal debates. And what this means is that praxis has a fundamentally different relationship to quote-unquote improving than we tend to assume, because improvement in this domain doesn't accumulate towards something that can be completed. It just expresses itself as an ongoing capacity to be well. And that capacity has to be sustained and exercised over and over again. Simply put, the domain of praxis, in the domain of praxis, there is no final version that is waiting to be completed. Now, poiesis works differently. Things like writing, building, designing, training a specific skill to a higher level, or just producing work that actually answers to an objective standard. In all of these cases, correction is expected and revision is usually necessary because there is actually something that you have to get right. There is a point where the work can reasonably be called finished. Now, finished, of course, doesn't simply mean flawless in every conceivable sense, but it does mean complete relatively to what the work is actually set out to be. In poiesis, the standard belongs to the work itself. You are basically able to look at what you have now produced and measure it against an objective standard, and you can actually make a judgment about whether it meets that standard or not. So in this domain, effort usually moves outward toward the object, and discipline usually serves the aim of making something that is actually excellent. And it is precisely because there is a genuine endpoint that the effort itself can resolve. In other words, at some point within an activity of this domain, you can stop the work and say that, yes, this is now considered finished, and this is now considered finished enough. Now, the reason Aristotle draws this distinction so carefully is that each domain collapses or crumbles when you import the logic of the other domain. So when you apply the standards of poiesis to praxis or vice versa. And here the more common error, and the one that actually does real damage to our own lives, is the error of applying the logic of poiesis to praxis. This is essentially the case where living is now treated as a project that should be eventually completed, or when the body or our health is approached as an objective moving toward a final and perfect vision, or when our habits are treated as components that should somehow lock into an ideal configuration in our lives and just simply stay there. In other words, the error in this case is to mistake the self for something that has to be engineered to perfection, or as close as to perfection as possible. And this ultimately leads us to treat every single element of our daily lives to be something that should be evaluated against an imagined final state. But remember, as we said before, praxis by definition doesn't allow for completion. A living person cannot reach a point where judgment is no longer needed, or our health can't arrive at some terminal condition of perfection. Our character also couldn't be assembled from parts that just snap into a perfect place. So when the logic of making is applied to the domain of living, effort turns inward and completely loses the possibility of completion. There is always another adjustment that could be made, because the model being imposed here assumes that there is a finished state, while praxis, so our lives, doesn't really culminate into a finished product. And as a result, discipline, which should in theory serve the work of living well, becomes a form of permanent supervision. And this, ultimately, leads us to feeling trapped in a kind of dissatisfaction that persists even when things seem to be going well in our lives. And this feeling will persist, not because we are constantly failing our lives, but simply because the standard itself is categorically misapplied. Now, the reverse error is less common, but it is still worth understanding here. So, when the logic of praxis is applied to poiesis, you basically end up with someone who approaches important work without a clear standard, who treats making something as if it were an open-ended process with no obligation to finish anytime soon. So the work usually ends up meandering, the revisions become aimless, and nothing is ever really finished. And the reason this happens is not because the person demands too much of the result or themselves. It is simply because they haven't really committed to making the kind of judgment that completion of anything actually requires. Remember, excellence in making anything demands that you eventually say that this is what I intended to make, and that the result I produced here actually meets that intention. So when you don't have this willingness to judge something as finished, work, which, unlike living a good life, actually has a finished state, this work essentially dissolves into a process that never really concludes. So the point I'm trying to make here is that these two domains are genuinely different, and each will ask something different of the person who moves within them. Praxis, for example, asks for consistency, responsiveness, and the capacity to sustain good judgment over time without really needing a finished result to validate the effort. Poiesis asks for a commitment to a certain standard, for the discipline to revise in light of that standard, and for the judgment to know when the work is actually considered finished. Any serious attempt at living a good life, a well-chosen life, will involve both. A person has to care for his body, order their daily habits, order their daily life, while also committing to forms of work that actually demand objective excellence. But these domains, they of course do not sit side by side idly without any friction. They overlap, they compete, and they are easily confused. So the real question here is not whether we can actually understand the distinction in theory, as we've just talked about. The real question is whether we can keep the logic of each domain clear in practice and judge well enough so that we do not demand or apply the logic from one domain to the other domain. And this is where Aristotle introduces phronesis, so practical wisdom, which is the concept that makes everything else compatible here. Now, phronesis, of course, isn't a method. It isn't a system that can be applied mechanical to everything else here. In Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle defines phronesis as a true disposition that is accompanied by reason toward action in things that are good or bad for a human being. And what makes this definition important is the word disposition, because this word tells us that practical wisdom isn't something you just know. It is something you are, it is something you become. It is the developed capacity to judge what a situation calls for, and then to act on that judgment with the right measure. Now, Aristotle introduces this because he understands that human life can't be managed by fixed calculations or rules. What counts as enough training or enough focus or enough restraint, this will change with age, with your health, or with the demands of this season you are currently in, or the circumstances that you are currently in. In other words, a principle that serves us well in one period of life or in one situation will become excessive in another. And the only thing that really tracks these changes accurately is our own judgment that is and has to be refined through our lived experience. Now, in the domain of praxis, phronesis is what prevents care from becoming control or obsession. The body matters because it supports our movement and our attention and our participation in this world. Training matters to us because it sustains our body's capacity to serve those ends. But there's also a point where additional optimization stops really supporting the body or our life and starts narrowing it. And phronesis is basically the capacity to sense where this exact point is. But the tricky thing here is that this isn't a fixed point or a fixed threshold. This is something that constantly changes. And it is only the person who has developed practical wisdom who can read this position without needing an explicit metric to locate it. They train because their body asks for it. They eat well because this now supports how they want to live, and they rest without really treating rest as a concession. In other words, the ongoing activity of living well is governed not by a program, but by an attentiveness that has actually been educated through years of paying attention to the consequences of certain actions. Practical wisdom essentially gives us the ability to know when a principle that usually applies doesn't really apply in this specific context, and when a discipline that usually serves you has actually started working against you. Now, in the domain of poiesis, phronesis, so practical wisdom, does something different but equally essential. Serious and important work demands certain standards and sustained effort, and rightly so, because the work has its own requirements. But even within this process, not every correction or refinement actually improves the result. Not every additional hour can produce something better. There is a point where revision still sharpens and makes the work better. But there is also a point where revision starts becoming a kind of senseless repetition. And the difference between the two is often invisible to the person inside of the process itself. So practical wisdom is what allows you to sense that difference. It helps you to determine how exacting a standard should actually be applied to the specific task in this particular context with these particular, let's say, constraints. It tells you when the work is genuinely unfinished and when the reluctance to stop working on a certain thing actually comes from something different entirely, which is usually the unwillingness to judge your own work. So without phronesis, the distinction between praxis and poiesis essentially stays abstract. We can understand it, hopefully, intellectually, and still find ourselves treating our bodies like a project with an end, or approaching our work without a real standard, or just simply swinging between the two domains in ways that leave both just really compromised. Practical wisdom is basically what turns the distinction into something that we can actually orient our efforts towards. It is basically what keeps the physical discipline proportionate and the ambition directed to an end. And perhaps the most important thing to understand about phronesis is how it actually forms. It doesn't come from reading a lot of books or studying a lot of theory in depth, though both can support it, of course. Phronesis actually comes from acting and then attending to the consequences of those actions, honestly. Aristotle is very explicit about this. Practical wisdom is gained the way any developed capacity is gained, which is through sustained practice and the willingness to be corrected by your own experience. He even says directly in Book 6 that a young person can become accomplished in geometry or mathematics, but he cannot become particularly wise, because phronesis requires the kind of experience that only time and lived situations can provide. Someone young can be brilliant and he can be disciplined and well-read, but they still won't have phronesis because they haven't lived long enough on this earth for their judgment to have been tested and refined across enough different conditions. So if phronesis is what actually allows us to move between praxis and poiesis without collapsing one into the other, then the question that naturally follows from all of this is what kind of life actually emerges when both domains are governed well over a long enough period of time. Because Aristotle, as he usually is, isn't just making a technical decision and then handing us some random tool for managing the boundaries. He is actually describing a life that has a particular quality to it, a quality that cannot be produced by getting any single domain right in isolation. So when someone has this capacity working across both domains simultaneously, their physical discipline will serve their life, rather than having their life organize itself around it. Their work will have genuine standards and will produce things that actually meet those standards. But it doesn't consume everything else because they have already developed the judgment to know when the effort is no longer improving the result, so they don't end up burning themselves out. And between these two, so the way they move through a day, the way they eat, and the way they rest, and how they respond to the people around them, all of this has a coherence that isn't imposed by any system from above, but actually expressed from within by someone who has learned through long and a lot of experience what each situation actually calls for. And here's something that becomes clear, but it is still easy to miss if you're still thinking in terms of individual activities. And it is this. When phronesis operates across both domains over time, then life itself starts to become the achievement. The relationship between how someone trains and how they think and how they work and how they conduct themselves in ordinary moments, all of this starts to express a single underlying orientation. And that orientation isn't something that a person has designed. It is something that was formed through years of bringing honest judgment to bear on real and unpredictable situations. It comes from reflection. This is basically what Aristotle means when he talks about a life that is lived well. He doesn't mean a life that feels good all the time, or a life that is arranged to minimize friction or discomfort, or a life where all the variables are finally optimized once and for all. In the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is careful to say that the good life is an activity of the soul in accordance with excellence. And here he means activity in the fullest sense, so something that is practiced and sustained, not just a condition that is reached for once and then held indefinitely. What he means is a life where the person's capacity for judgment has actually developed to the point where they can now meet whatever comes at them with the appropriate response, where their effort is now governed by their wisdom rather than their anxiety, and where the ongoing work of living well is experienced not as a burden, but as a natural expression of their character that is formed through this sustained practice. Excellence, ultimately, isn't a destination. It is a living capacity that has to be exercised for as long as we actually live, and it is only as good as the judgment that governs it. The person who has internalized this through experience stops asking whether they are finished now and starts asking whether they are responding well to life. And that change in orientation or mindset from completion to responsiveness is what will turn effort from a source of pressure into something that can actually sustain a life that is worth living.